Welcome back to Beyond the Hyphen. I'm Mark Lee, your host. Today I'm joined by Stanford Thompson, Executive Director of Equity Arc, a national coalition dedicated to creating equitable pathways for aspiring classical musicians, and also founder of Play on Philly, one of the country's leading music education programs inspired by Venezuela's well-known El Sistema movement. Throughout his career, Mr. Thompson has worked at the intersection of artistic excellence, educational opportunity, and community impact, helping shape how institutions and the greater community think about access, representation, and belonging in and through the arts. His leadership has helped expand opportunities for countless young musicians while advancing a broader vision of what the arts can mean for individuals and communities. Mr. Thompson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Mark, thanks so much for having me.
I'd love to begin with your own journey. You grew up in a family of music educators, studied, trumpet at Curtis, and initially followed what many would perhaps consider a traditional path as a musician. Looking back, was there a moment where you realized that your greatest impact might not necessarily come only from performing on stage yourself, but also from creating opportunities for others and sort of branching off and utilizing your artistry to engage fellow artists?
Sure. So I would certainly say that growing up as a young musician, I loved ensemble bass opportunities. I played in probably four or five different youth ensembles in the metro Atlanta area. I enjoyed my summers at Interlochen. I was going there. The first summer was the summer after my seventh grade year.
Wow.
And so I just got a lot of energy from it. I love the friends that I was meeting. And one of my first projects was creating the Atlanta Trumpet Festival based at Emory University when I was a junior in high school. And I just love this idea of creating community within groups of people that really didn't have those opportunities to come together and share their love for music. That just stuck with me. When I went through college, I started a 2 week summer camp in Reading, Pennsylvania. And that really got me primed by the time I graduated from Curtis. Um, the same time when Dudamel was being named the music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And us here in the US, we started paying a lot of attention to El Sistema. So that was just kind of a natural progression for me, getting bit by that bug when I was younger and always thinking about music's power to bring people together, of course, uplift those that are participating and playing, and also uplift people in audiences and throughout communities.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think it's very clear that, ever since becoming involved with, the Sistema Fellows program and spent time studying El Sistema in Venezuela, um, it sort of very natural, like you mentioned, being, bitten by that bug early and having that sense and motivation to incorporate that into your self artistry along the years. I'm curious, what did you see there that fundamentally changed how you thought about music education and its role in society all the way up until now?
Yeah. Well, here was a big program out of Venezuela that produced the music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic when he was, I think he was 27 when the announcement was made. Probably he was 28 or 29 when he actually started as music director. It was a huge deal. And Dudamel didn't go to Curtis or Juilliard or the Vienna Conservatory. He came out of this program from Venezuela. There were also members of the Berlin Philharmonic and other top orchestras, but their founder, the late Dr. Jose Antonio Abreu, the way that he would talk about this program, that, it was a social program, it was transforming the lives of kids. And I was sitting there thinking and reflecting on my own personal journey. And that's what music did for me before I became, a talented trumpet player, making money from it, performing and teaching and things like that. And to have somebody like Dr. Abreu, like, see me as a human first, that meant a lot. And especially at a place like Curtis, where, of course, there's a lot of focus on becoming a performer. I never forget, going to school with Yuja Wong and Ray Chen, and it was so clear looking at them what they wanted to do. I was still figuring myself out, but I knew for sure I wasn't interested in being on stage like they were really, preparing for. So when I just look at all of these experiences at once, and in my final semester at Curtis, again, I'm watching Dr. Abreu's TED Prize speech back from, I think, 2009. That was just very, very inspiring. And I just knew then this is what I need to be doing. And let me give it a try. I'm young. I have 45 more years of my professional career ahead of me. Let me try this for a couple of years. And if it doesn't work out, then, I'll try something else. I won't forget how to play the trumpet or anything like this. And, within the first couple of months, I just really fell in love with being an administrator and using my skills and my connections to build these opportunities for young people.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I think, being an Equity Arc fellow myself, being a young aspiring musician myself, and seeing people like you mentioned, Ray Chen and Yuja Wang, and even Lang Lang, they all went to Curtis, but they feel so far away and out of reach, and they're idolized. But I think being accessible and being what Mr. Stevenson mentioned at the convening, being proximate in terms of inspiring young folks, I think is all the more powerful. Not to say that their journeys and their lives are not remarkable, but you first came to Philadelphia as a student, right? But later returned to help launch Play on Philly. Following your experiences with El Sistema, you had developed, if I'd be so bold, a belief that music could be more than artistic training, that it could be a vehicle for opportunity, for belonging, and community transformation, right? What made you believe? I'm really curious. What made you believe Philadelphia was the right place to sort of put that philosophy into practice?
Right. Well, as a student, I did a lot of community outreach to schools all over the city. I also teamed up with the school district to create a summer brass program that was held on campus at Curtis and would bring in Philly orchestra musicians to do master classes and teaching and things. And by the time I was finished, I saw the disparities between what we received at Curtis and what the kids were getting in the school district. And literally, schools that were 4 or 5 blocks away from Curtis having closets full of broken instruments, and going to a conservatory where they were spending 20 million a year on us, not asking us to pay tuition. And for some reason, we couldn't figure out a $70 repair to a clarinet around the corner. So that's kind of the worlds that I was going back and forth between. And having no expense spared to be able to work with the conductors and the faculty that I had a chance to. So I just thought that maybe I can do something here. I have access to these people at Curtis and the Philly Orchestra that have money, but I'm also part of this community that I live in. And can I get these two groups of people to see the benefit in, helping one another? And that's really what I think is the beautiful challenge of this work. And it was one that really, excited me and really it encouraged me to find a way to make this work in Philly. I also thought about doing the work in Atlanta, where I grew up,
Right.
and was having conversations there, but just something kept kind of pulling me back to Philly. And slowly we found a core group of people to really come together and help the program get off the ground. Um, and then it grew beyond my wildest imagination. Um, and I thought we were just going to be this small 50, 60, 75 kid program. Um, and that grew to hundreds of kids and multiple sites and a multi-million dollar budget and things like that. So that was it was neat to see this baby grow and especially over a 13-year period, and now to see it continue to grow um, even more from then.
Yeah, and it's grown to be recognized nationally, but also keep its identity. I think grassroots identity, and I think that's why it's so powerful and expands with such a strong foundation. But every institution or movement, like you mentioned, starts with an idea, with a desire, with an issue to solve, right? As small as it might be. When you think back to those early years, what were some of the biggest challenges, and what kept you going when success was far from guaranteed?
Oh, wow. This is a great question. I mean, there were many, many ups and downs. What I kept coming back to was that core team that I mentioned that came together around this idea from the beginning. They were very encouraging. The families that I worked with, they also were encouraging to see how much they were appreciating the program, that to see how much their kids were benefiting from it. I think that gave me a lot of energy and drive to kind of keep things moving forward. Certainly, there were very, very discouraging and difficult moments. There were even very close moments when we thought we might need to shut down the program,
Mhm.
or perhaps maybe lay off half the teachers and staff and things like that. Um, but I would certainly say that just, keeping in mind the impact that we're hoping to have, reaching out to those people that were supporting us, and even in those tough times, asking if they might do a little bit more to help keep us, okay. But I will also say this: I made a lot of mistakes, and some of those mistakes made it more difficult for the program to really thrive. And there were some very important lessons that I learned in my own leadership and in the way that I was administering the program that changed over time. So I would certainly say any organization that is ran by a young person, it's just, it's destined to have some issues. And it's not because, we're, um, you know, doing something reckless. It's just a lot of times we just don't know. So that's really been, or it was a really great learning opportunity and growth experience for me to go through all of it, and that made it even easier to start Equity Arc after working with not only hundreds of kids in Philadelphia, but I was also part of the creation of El Sistema USA. So we had, well over 100 programs and 30,000 kids. And I was really seeing among all of our programs that there were a handful in each program that were interested in pursuing a professional career in classical music. So Equity Arc became that response. And in starting Equity Arc, there were a lot of lessons that I learned through Play on Philly that made it much stronger and focused, and um, easier for people to really jump on board early on in the process.
Yeah, and I think what, building a little bit on what you were talking about learning those lessons and relying on that core team, like having the right people is so important. And, even just it doesn't even have to be running an organization, right? Within your family, having the right people to go back to, having the right friend group to go back to. I think in a field like music and the arts where especially now there's a stigma that excellence and opportunity are competing goals. You need to have people who ground you. You need to have a community that is sensitive to what it means to really live it, to practice the belief that excellence and opportunity are not competing goals. Yet in conversations about music education, those values are often again framed as being intention, particularly when they are negative viewpoints toward DEI in the music and the arts. Why do you think that misconception persists today?
I think it is a very lame excuse um, that we have allowed to uh, continue to be told and really define our experience as classical musicians. Um, I think it has been a tool that has was also used to keep women away from classical music for such a long time. Um, but I say that there is a balance here where, in our art form, it's important to play in tune and play in the right style and character, and to be able to make phrases and make music convincingly, and to do that at a really high level. And I think as humans, yes, we're always trying to pursue greater excellence as musicians, as athletes, as scientists, engineers. All of that goes on. I think that's part of it. However, I think it's really easy to use excellence and hide behind it, to also perpetuate different biases or exclusion in decision making. I think it's also hard to see that where some people are excellent, that's simply a reflection of the opportunities that they have received. So, as an aspiring conductor, you have to have the opportunity to stand in front of an orchestra and to practice. It's much different than like pulling a violin or a trumpet out your case and going home and practicing. But who provides those opportunities?
Mhm.
And if those opportunities are only provided to those who are excellent, well, how do we define excellence? And how might we be rewarding privilege in ways where we completely look over folks that have, they're capable of doing the work? So I think those, this whole excellence and opportunity, it goes hand in hand. And I don't think it is a bad thing at all to recognize that there are groups of people who haven't had the opportunity traditionally for decades, and to provide spaces for them to have those opportunities where they can be seen in light of the excellence that they bring to music.
Yeah, I could 200%, wholeheartedly agree. I think, um, during that weekend, I met so many just utterly amazing, quirky young people that I would have never otherwise met. And a lot of, I found my circumstance to be very different from a lot of those just utterly, astounding musicians. You've worked with thousands of young musicians. Um, now through Equity Arc for 3 years. Is there a particular student story or moment or event you could anchor the ethos of all of this work in because of how it changed either your career or even more so what became possible for the community of young musicians?
Wow. Um, yeah, I think that I'll kind of tell two, maybe three sets of quick stories here. I think one of those stories is looking back at the opportunities I received and many of my dear colleagues when we were younger. Um, in programs like the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra Talent Development Program. And there are, a couple of dozen programs that are very similar around the country. And to think about the musicians that we studied with, the programs we were able to access,
Mhm.
and to think about a lot of really, really wonderful opportunities. I remember taking my first trip to Berlin when I was a junior in high school with the Atlanta Symphony Youth Orchestra, and to sit in the Berlin Philharmonic, watching Claudio Abbado conduct Mahler's Sixth Symphony. And just last week, I happened to be in Madrid, Spain, where the Atlanta Symphony Youth Orchestra was there on a tour. Um, and looking at many of those kids, some of them Equity Art Fellows, and the experience that they were having, and just thinking just 20 years before, that's the experience that I was having. And to know how rich their lives are going to become over the next 20 years because they have music in it. So I reflect on, again, my own story, but then I think about the stories of many of the Equity Arc Fellows that we've been able to work with. And one is, out of Atlanta, Sean, a horn player. We also went to the same high school. We were both lucky to have the same band director, even over these 20 different years.
Mhm.
And we recently sat down for a long conversation, probably about 2 months ago. Um, and to hear this young man, like what he's thinking about music, what role he wants to play in it, the thing that really got me about his story was that he understands the traditional routes
Mhm.
of becoming a classical musician that you were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation.
Mhm.
And when you go to a place like the Curtis Institute of Music, I mean, you're going to a place that has that rich history behind it, and that's what it's continuing to teach. But in my conversation with Sean, he sees the future of classical music completely differently. He's growing up in a time where you don't have to be on the stage like Yu Wong to have an audience of hundreds of thousands. You can do that from your practice room on social media. Um, and to think about all of the ways he can now collaborate with different artists all over the world instantly
Mhm.
and create something that is consumable, something that has impact,
Mhm.
just really made me rethink what I believe is possible in classical music. It makes me rethink the goals of Equity Arc, where you all have so many things that you want to say through music. It's not going to be through these traditional channels that I went through. And even what I was exposed to 20 years ago, certainly it's not the same world that even my teachers were dealing with 20 years before that.
Mhm.
Um, so it's just, again, I think about, Sean and his next steps. And for many years, I thought about this with myself. I thought about this with Sean and many of you all Equity Arc Fellows of like, man, like, do we really understand that? And it's so hard to make it as a classical musician.
Right.
There isn't a lot of room. I mean, how many yo-yo ma's are really on the circuit? And what is it like every 10 years there's space for one more cello superstar to
Mhm.
hit the major circuit and play with all the top orchestras, but that's just not the way to think anymore.
Mhm.
And it's really to say, I mean, you all love this art form, you have something to say about it, you have these new ways of reaching audiences that we never had, and you all are starting to rewrite all the rules. Same thing with artificial intelligence. I mean, even you don't know what's going to happen with AI, but
Right.
you're at the very, very beginning of all of this. And I remember being at the beginning of the app revolution in smartphones, and that even allowed for people to communicate the way that they do or show their artistry on social media.
Mhm.
Again, I was just at the beginning of those tools coming out, and we never could imagine that one again could be an Instagram superstar
Mhm. Yeah.
and not need to set their feet on the stage of Carnegie Hall. So again, I mean, you guys are at the beginning of all this. Um, and I think instead of telling the stories of, oh, when I was, 20 years ago when I was in high school, it really like, let's talk about the future. Let's
Mhm.
talk about how we equip all of you to really embrace technology, embrace where the world is going, the good and the bad with it. And how are you all going to respond as artists to all of these moments? How are you going to respond to artists or respond to situations in your backyard as artists? Respond to issues and challenges halfway across the world, or challenges like maybe the environment that threatens all of us. So, these are things that I've learned in sitting down with Sean, again, hearing his story. and just, taking a step back and just, again, really thinking about how to empower you all and equip you all with the skills that you can stay flexible to wherever the world turns next.
Yeah, and wow. I mean, I personally engaged with Sean. He's a great guy. Um, being both interns and having that opportunity to work together. I think part of what you mentioned about taking advantage of this new landscape, and utilizing social media that can be often seen as terrible or a rabbit hole that you don't want to go into, but knowing how to utilize that to share a message. If you look at Jazz at Lincoln Centers, Jazz Call for Freedom that when Marsalis began using just these simple recordings made by not the most prominent jazz musicians on the planet, but anyone who has a worthy narrative behind a small clip of Duke Ellington or Sonny Rollins, to share with the community. And I think that is so powerful, and we absolutely need to use this tool of social media to connect with each other across the world. So I could not agree more. And that is something that, as a young musician myself, but also civic advocate, I think we definitely have to explore that intersectionality of utilizing our art, not to politicize music, but to use our artistry and our craft and our musicianship to initiate change that we want to see outside of music in our lives every single day. And for listeners who may not be familiar, Equity Arc works to create pathways with partners nationwide for aspiring young BIPOC classical musicians from historically underrepresented backgrounds, um, through this national coalition model with plenty of resources, mentors, and a national meeting every year. Mr. Thompson, um, as mentioned earlier, is the executive director. But I was wondering, from your vantage point, what problem were you seeing exactly nationally, or perhaps from a region, that inspired this, that couldn't be solved by any single orchestra or music program just acting alone?
All right. Well, I think a lot of times, a handful of organizations believe that they have the resources to solve a really big problem across the country. And when my colleagues and I, as 10 years ago, were coming around and talking about these challenges, well, what would happen is that some of the best ideas would then get copied by all of these organizations across the country.
Mhm.
So there are roughly 25 orchestras that have fellowship programs for minority musicians. And there are, almost 20 um, pathway programs across the country working with pre-college students. We have community music schools and summer camps that also have their special initiatives. But the issue that I saw was that not a lot of them were really talking together. And then there is no infrastructure to actually follow up with any of the ideas because, yeah, people would get together once a year and talk about the ideas, but then they would go back home and they're busy.
Mhm.
Um, so we thought, look, a way to solve this is let's coordinate all of these organizations doing work. Let's encourage collaboration and let's create a staff that can do this work throughout the year in between these major convenings of the League of American Orchestras and the Sphinx organization and many others. Um, so that's the need that we saw, probably 7 years ago.
Mhm.
um, and then 5 years ago, we formed Equity Arc and started doing the work. Then the Trump administration came in with their executive order on DEI,
Right.
wanting to rewrite the script on what diversity, equity, and inclusion meant. And we saw an opportunity and really looking back at the past 5 years of our work and to say, there's still a gap, no matter what's happening at the federal level. But the gap is a lot of the musicians, um, they don't have the skills to push through a lot of adversity. And here we are getting a lot of adversity and pushback.
Mhm.
Um, and to think about, how many musicians are not getting equitable opportunities because a year ago, a lot of these organizations across the country, in fear of some type of negative response from our federal administration, they really curbed a lot of their programs. So we'll see the impact of that 10 years from now. But to think about today, the big gap was a lot of these musicians, once they start getting a little bit of pushback or they experience rejection, they walk into a space where they don't feel like they belong, then they quit. They don't want to be part of it anymore. So, of course, we thought it was super important at Equity Art to create these spaces where the musicians could come together, and they could take that armor off and they could be themselves, and connect with other, new friends and colleagues who are also interested in the same path that they're in. Um, and I think with all the work that we have been doing, um, we have the opportunity to encourage these musicians to continue to move on. So that's a gap that we see today that we're working really, really hard to build a coaching platform that helps these musicians navigate all the challenges they're going to face through college and the beginning part of their careers. And it also builds curiosity for things about, where the world is moving and where the world is changing. Things, as much as we might not like some of these things, it's just where things are heading.
Mhm.
um, there's just going to be less people that are advocates for this work and can see beyond musical excellence, as we described earlier, and provide them with the opportunity. Well, how do you help these young musicians navigate even those challenges? So that's what we'll be focused on. And we believe that if we can fill that gap, that many more musicians will hang in there. They'll have the tools to kind of push forward and persevere. And we think that that really will change things in terms of the art form having a chance to breathe and perhaps be reborn in a way that's very vibrant.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciate about Equity Arc is that the conversation isn't just about access, as important as that step is. A student can be admitted into Curtis, into Juilliard, or into any college, and still feel like they don't belong. And being a BIPOC musician myself, I can directly attest to the community aspect, um, that Equity Arc sort of provided. Um, there was great mentorship. There was, you learn getting to learn, not just from a professional musician, in the musician standpoint, but also how to make a career for yourself, how to engage with other people, how to be a musician human being, right? And at the same time, I think that was so important because many young people carry so many identities at once, which I talked about very briefly earlier. They may be musicians, they may be students, they may be immigrants, first generation Americans, they might be people of color, they might be advocates, they might be aspiring, civil rights attorneys, or community leaders, all simultaneously. Um, Mr. Thompson, what do you think about belonging through that lens of intersectionality, and what responsibility, like you mentioned earlier, do institutions have to recognize the full humanity of the young people in our society today?
Excellent question. Um, I believe that there's a two-way street here in terms of belonging. Um, so I don't necessarily put the entire responsibility on an institution. I say this from the standpoint of growing up in Atlanta, in the Mormon church, going to Boy Scouts, playing in youth orchestras, going to youth arts education camps,
Mhm.
and oftentimes I was one of the few people of color in the room. Um, and or I should say, I was one of the few Black people in the room in many of those spaces. And I remember how my parents taught me about belonging. And number one, it was just, I belong in these spaces. and really building up that confidence within myself, knowing that I was also going to have that, those open arms to embrace the different people around me.
Hmm.
But at the same time, those people, they need to accept me, and
Hmm.
the institutions need to do everything they can to accept me.
Right.
So I believe that there are very specific things that institutions can do to help kind of create this sense of belonging and creating more spaces, creating the time for us to really connect in a meaningful way. And I think any great community does it, like the Mormon church, like Boy Scouts, like my summers at Interlochen, of creating so much space for us to be kids and be with one another, be inclusive of all of the different identities that we have. I
Hmm.
remember being at Interlochen in a cabin with 15 other boys and to talk about the different identities geographically, racially, in terms of sexual orientation, the even political standpoints. I remember having really meaningful conversations with those who grew up in more conservative households, much different than the one that I grew up in. So there are all of these spaces,
Hmm.
but sometimes it's tough when the program is just about come in and make music,
Right.
and there's not enough space. It's really easy to just look around the room and see how you're different, see where you think you fit in, and then next thing you really feel left out of what's happening. And even in my youth orchestra, I was the only kid from my high school
Mm.
and probably one of like two or three kids from the county that I lived in that was in the youth orchestra. So when I looked around the room, I didn't see a bunch of my friends, like everybody else, and it took effort. So anyway, I think again, it's uh, a two-way street, in a way. And again, I think it's really important how we help our young people realize what they can do to have those outstretched arms and to encourage institutions to make the space for them to be seen.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. You mentioned Interlochen, being someone who, uh, yeah, has participated myself and BU Tanglewood and these awesome just summer programs. I think what made them special was bringing these young people together and to, I would say, encourage is a bit of a weaker word, but almost force them to share that vulnerability together in a cabin, right? When it's dark, when lights are out, but you can't fall asleep. What do you talk about? And so I think those opportunities for discussion outside of music are what made these opportunities um, as special as they were. And this sort of bridges me into, and as we wind down a little bit, to quite recently, just last year, many people across the country were introduced to Equity Arc through the 60 Minutes story surrounding, like you mentioned, the canceled U.S. Marine Band collaboration with the Wind Symphony, and the cuts to funding for DEI by the Trump administration. What struck me wasn't just the funding for DEI or policy debate itself, but also the fact that these were students who had earned an opportunity, prepared for it, and then, watched it disappear through circumstances completely outside of their control at the ignorance of not just one person, right? As someone who was at the center of that moment, what did that experience teach you about leadership and the importance of proactivity, but also what do you think young artists should learn from that sudden moment and from that moment of precarity?
We almost canceled and didn't move forward with it. And one of the most important things that I learned is, what does it mean to stand up for these kids? What does it mean to stand up for people who can't necessarily stand up for themselves and have their voices heard? And when we went back to the students, we first told them, hey, yeah, this thing got canceled. But then when we came back and said, we got this other opportunity, would you all still come to DC? And by the way, there are going to be cameras there and we're going to document it. It's going to be on national television. Like, it's a little scarier. And we're going to be on the news segment that we know Trump hates and the news network that he wants to demolish. So he's going to see this. His team is going to see this. We perhaps put everybody at risk. But those kids and families, you know, almost all of them said, yes, we'll be there. And we only gave them a week's notice. Instead of the program happening, at the beginning of May in 2 or 3 months, we said, no, we're going to do it right now. Next week, we're meeting in DC. Can you all come?
Mhm.
And when we got together for our private dinner the very first day before the news camera showed up, just kid after kid was just saying, thank you for standing up for us. Thank you for giving us this space. We're eager to tell our stories. We're eager to make music
Mhm.
with one another and with these other musicians. So, anyway, that was the biggest thing that I learned. And then the other thing is now looking back, it's been a little bit over a year. There's some perspective here of what it means to have principles and to stand up for those principles and to stick by them, even when it's not convenient. And for Equity Arc still to say that we are recognizing musicians um, from very specific cultural backgrounds and racial and ethnic groups.
Mhm.
It's pretty significant to stand by those principles at a time like this. And if we get shut down, we get shut down. If nobody wants to give us money, we at least have, moved on in a very principled way, rather than changing those principles because they're no longer convenient.
Right.
So I think a lot about that. And I'll give one asterisk here. I do want to recognize there are many institutions that are under direct threat, having hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars withheld for very important things like scientific and health research, things that help people all over the world and saves lives and employs a lot of people. I do want to acknowledge that those dynamics as well. And for some institutions, I know this is a very difficult thing for them to hang on to their principles during this time. But certainly want to say that in our space of classical music, I think it is important as artists that we're able to maintain those principles.
Yeah, I mean, historically, music has often played a role in broader movements, and the shared principles, whether it's the civil rights movement, right? Those principles of equality and fighting for equal justice, equal rights, but also taking that spirit, that small but mighty spirit, during the 1960s and the 70s, um, to the jazz age, and sort of that music of stories and suffering and sharing that identity. They operated on the fundamental principles of not being afraid to share our story when it matters the most, even though there could be public backlash, even though there could be people who are discontent with the decision that you make to persevere or to continue to build coalitions and to share this. um, like I mentioned earlier, jazz at Lincoln Center's Jazz Call for Freedom, they welcome anyone to submit, and I actually, you know on a whim, submitted a recording with a fellow trumpet player, who's all the way in Florida, in Kissimmee, Florida. And I think I use that as an anecdote to show that this is also intergenerational. It's not limited to just one generation. Um, something started by Wynton Marsalis, who operated in an ecosystem that is so different from what, as a young musician, I now operate in. We can still nonetheless share a same moment and share a same movement. And I sort of direct this into a question where it's, what role can artists play in civic life, in democracy, right? Public discourse, and helping communities navigate difficult crossroads.
I believe art has the unique power to give voice to a lot of situations and people and things that just don't have it. Um, I think it is important for artists to use their art to be able to make sense of the world around them. For those artists that want to do it, to give them space to push back. Um, and it's always been a part, like you mentioned, in our, individual and collective societies. Um, and I think it's also an important way to bring people together. Um, as far as I know, I mean, every great protest has always had a really good soundtrack going to it. Um, and we certainly know the power that music can have to really stir the soul
Mhm.
and really kind of guide the heart. So I think it's important for us to um, have those outlets and to make sure that art is front and center. Um, and I think we, as artists, we have a responsibility to use our art in that way and to connect people in really meaningful ways. It's not about us. And I do believe it's about the greater good and connection, and really having a meaningful impact.
Yeah, to I think to amplify that, um, it's so counterintuitive sometimes, to be a musician and to participate in something like, a protest, a No Kings protest, for example, or something that can be labeled as quote unquote political or, you know, um, controversial. But I do think that it is important to take that power carefully to carefully navigate the intersection of artistry and musicianship, as well as civic change. And you've spent so much of your career helping young people do that, find their voice through music. Um, to close this out, when you think about the next generation of artists on an optimistic note, what gives you hope? And when an equity, ARC fellow is 40 years old, looking back on their life and their career, um, what do you hope that they've become, or at least hold in a spirit in their mindset? Not only as musicians, but as citizens, as leaders, and as members of their communities.
Also interesting. I turned 40 in December. So when you ask the question about, all of that stuff, like, whoa, I'm going to be 60 at that point. I hope that they're able to look back at these moments they had, in Equity Arc, in their pathway programs, their youth orchestras, summer camps. I mean, the experiences that you all are having right now, and to really be able to just understand how significant these opportunities of connection, opportunities to come together around a shared identity, and to work together, strive together, and that these are the types of lessons that, again, guide the decisions you make for the next 20 years. You all are going to do amazing stuff that I never thought of or was able to accomplish. And certainly, I look back of the people who propped me up 20 years ago and gave opportunities that I hope, let's say 40 years from then, 20 years from today, there's even greater impact that I'm able to help to facilitate. And I'm really looking for you all to be the next leaders in this space. It's just you all can start leading today. You don't have to wait 20 years. And as I shared with my story, I was already leading by the time I was a senior in high school and making community, and I just knew that I needed that to be part of my, artistic identity of bringing people together. I mean, of course, when I was 17 or 18, I had no idea it would be in the form of Play on Philly and L System USA and Equity Art. I mean, I wasn't thinking all of that back then. Um, so certainly would just say that very optimistic about the future of the arts. Never once have I sat here saying, "Oh, classical music is dying," or technology and social media is going to ruin us. I don't sit here and say AI is going to ruin us at all. Um, I I think it's going to be another strong tool that we can use as artists. I hope we don't mess it up as society, and that you all find meaningful ways to connect with one another in ways that, I didn't think was possible.
Yeah, well, Mr. Thompson, I want to thank you, for sharing that question's answer, but also just thank you not only for joining us today, and also for the work that you've dedicated so much of your time and energy and expertise to. As a young aspiring musician myself, who is not driven away by the cynicism, that is rampant across certain communities and in society today, but motivated by it, having interviewed, um, like I mentioned earlier, Congress people, current and former CEOs of civic organizations like the NAACP, Stop AAP I Hate, and more. I've truly come to realize the importance of taking advantage of that intersectionality, a word that I love to use to exemplify the importance of tying in civic advocacy and the own storytelling of young people. Music is such a powerful tool, an avenue for that crucial storytelling right now, and I think storytelling is absolutely the way to go to reduce this ignorance, this rampant ignorance that in so many cases is not by fault of our young people, but by the current pre-existing infrastructures and societal norms. And that is what drives the entire ethos of this platform, Beyond the Hyphen, and our organizational branch, the Hyphen Foundation. Our listeners are musicians, they're students, they're advocates all across the world, and your journey offers such a powerful reminder that the arts can be a catalyst for personal growth and positive change. So a lot of gratitude for your partnership and continued leadership, Mr. Thompson.
Well, Mark, thanks again for having me. I wish you and the hyphen the very, very best. Thanks again for having me.